Hi, folks. Facebook Live, Privacy TV News Live here from FPF. I'm joined by Lauren Smith, one of our policy counsels. Lauren works on really cool stuff here like connected cars, self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, algorithms that benefit society and maybe discriminate. How do we make sure they do the good stuff and not the bad stuff, as well as data and disability community issues. So she's joining me today. We're going to have a little quick chat. We're getting ready for some other events this week. GDPR is coming up, as many of you know. If you'd like to join us for a toast to all the people who worked so hard for GDPR compliance, we are hosting an event at the European Embassy. I think we're not supposed to call it that because technically European Union is not a country, but the building of the European delegation to the UN. So ping us, we'll send you an invitation. You can also participate remotely. I don't know that they're going to Facebook Live it, but there is an online registration. And if you want to gather with your staff or your colleagues in your conference room, the scotch is on you, but we'll watch the ball drop. This is going to be midnight time in Brussels, so 5 or 6 o'clock in Washington time. And if you want to commiserate, you've been working really hard, or just hear the European ambassador to the US say thank you to everybody, we invite you to join us. All right, we got 2 topics. We're going to talk about a data grab by the California Public Utility Commission that Lauren has been dealing with around self-driving cars. But first, we're going to talk about, very briefly, some of the announcements coming out this week from Google I/O, the big developer conference where Google announces a lot of new advances, and some of the debates I've been having with some colleagues in the privacy and policy community about some of the issues that people are having when you deal with smart home devices. So I don't know, do you have at home an Echo or one of the smart home type things you do? We've got a couple in our house. We've got a couple here around the office, and we enjoy them, play with them. We even have the Amazon, the Echo Show. Let me show it to you here on my desk. This is, the Echo with a screen, so it's really cool. But one of the things that some people have been suggesting is that kids who ask for music should say please when they talk to their smart home device. And some critics say that kids are learning to be, rude because they're like, play music, play my Spotify list, play the top 10, or, text my friend. And are they going to talk to each other and parents and others in that sort of demanding way? Should we be teaching kids to say, Alexa, please? And I've pushed back at that because Johanna Bryson, a wonderful academic in the UK, has done some really interesting work about the dangers of anthropomorphizing robots. If we start thinking that these are people, we'll share a lot of data with them. We might be gulled by them. These are companies, right? Do you say please when you hit the remote to open your car, even though there's some sophisticated technology nowadays involved? AI and these smart tools are being built into all of our technology, and certainly we want to teach people to be polite to other humans and maybe even nice to animals. But I'd argue that if we start saying pretty please, even from a kid, I want them to know they're dealing with artificial intelligence, but it's actually a company, and it should sound and feel like a company, so that I understand that I am sharing information and that I'm giving a command to a device, and that we don't treat these things as humans. Now, it doesn't mean they shouldn't sound more natural. It's annoying when you talk to something that sounds very robotic. Google, in some of the announcements it made yesterday, showed some advances where their customer service type bots and voice interactive things were far more human sounding. And I think that's fine. But I think going as far as trying to teach kids, well, say please when you're talking to Alexa, gets us down a path. There's got to be a way that we can teach kids, to be polite to humans without having to say, go be polite to machines because that's the same thing. They ought to really understand the difference. What do you think? Do I have a point here? I got some pushback from folks who said, we're going to teach kids to be kind of crude, and then they'll talk to their parents like that and be demanding as well.
I kind of disagree. I think they're already anthropomorphized with the voice, with the natural commands, and I think enabling opportunities for kids to, and adults, honestly, to command people around them, I think we could all benefit from a little more conditioning to be
And you don't
polite.
worry that maybe we'll be fooled into, sharing or divulging. I mean, imagine if we had that presentation by one of the robotics companies. Toyota has some really great robots that are increasingly being used to help care for the elderly. Obviously, in Japan, there's a huge number of elderly and not enough caregivers around the world. This will be a problem. And, they were debating what's the right path. You want a companion that might support somebody emotionally. And, if it's going to roam around your house, it might as well be a cute, creature and not kind of a zombie robot. But you can sort of see the danger of maybe companies being too intimate in our lives. We'll post a link to Joanna Bryson's work, but Lauren's view, I think, is one that certainly others shared, and I was, debating some very intelligent, critics who were pointing this out. And when Google, showed these latest advances, you remember one of our previous assistants was scheduling for me with a CEO of an AI company. And when she sent me the confirmation email, I said, hey, did you realize you were corresponding with a bot? And she said, what? I said, look, Amy Ingram, AI. And it did disclose it. It said powered by artificial intelligence, but she was just scheduling. She wasn't paying attention. And she was a bit offended because she was making some small talk, thank you. And I said, well, could you tell at all? And she did respond very quickly, right? But you can imagine with some of the advances that we're seeing that could be very hard. And I'd like people to be able to distinguish, even if it means maybe having to, be a bit more blunt. This is a light switch, even though it, has voice involved. This is a key switch. This is just a sophisticated computer program. Do you type please every time you, hit send? Should Gmail say please first? Anyway, let's switch to the important topic. So, Lauren, you filed this week on behalf of FPF at the California Public Utility Commission. What was going on? What were the concerns raised there?
Yeah, so the CPUC had put out a proposed decision that would enable pilot programs for ride sharing in autonomous vehicles. So enabling sort of taxi service for Californians who can now ride around in driverless cars that could either have a driver sitting in the seat or a remote operator, so with no one else in the car. So it's an exciting program. It's one of the sort of many regulatory approaches to AVs that's being taken in California, and it would create this permitting process to allow these to go forward. The reason that we weighed in is that it called for a number of criteria to be met by companies providing this service and a fair amount of data reporting to the CPUC. And just in case folks don't know, the CPUC is a consumer protection agency that oversees things like passenger service in California. So that sort of falls under them. The Department of Motor Vehicles is also regulating AVs to some extent.
Oh yeah, I forgot to ask about that. Why is this? Most of the debate around issues like, do you need a licensed driver, right, which would create a problem for people with disabilities, or the whole notion of the car being self-driving if you got to have a licensed driver. That's been at the motor vehicles. Why is the PUC suddenly involved?
So the DMV process mostly focuses on the operation of the autonomous vehicle itself and its ability to be on the roads in California, whereas the CPUC sort of got involved, I believe, at a somewhat later stage to oversee the passenger service aspect of it. So in the sense
So if it's going to be like a taxi service or something like that, it's anticipated for some of these things?
Yeah, so
buses or...
Yeah, so they have jurisdiction over things like ride sharing, things like taxis. So this would create a secondary permitting process for companies that want to offer this service. And there's a number of requirements, many of which are not related to data at all. But the reason that we weighed in is there were a couple of aspects of data collection that would be required in this process that some of which gave us concerns. So here at FPF, we recognize that data can be used to improve public services, to create valuable functions for cities and others. But there's been a couple of places where we've weighed in because we think that municipal data sets about use of transportation services can create risks for individual privacy.
Like disclosing everywhere you've been and where you are, your location.
So there's been a couple of different processes we've weighed in. The New York City Taxi and Limo Commission, as well as New York State, had some proceedings within the last couple of years where they tried to call for sort of precise geolocation data of every trip to be reported to the city. And there's a couple of concerns that can come from that type of disclosure, so that we can potentially get into.
And that already went bad, right? The New York data, there already was a situation where the taxi data was disclosed and somebody showed that by matching up license plates and hack licenses and they could show where some number of people went, maybe they were near strip clubs or the like. Maybe law enforcement gets access to the data. I mean, it's pretty sensitive data.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of issues. One, these agencies are subject to freedom of information laws that could compel them to disclose the information. And then there's sort of, this growing field around de-identification of this kind of information, and how possible is it really to de-identify precise geolocation information. And there's some nuance to it, but it can create real risks. So any sort of process to call for more of this data requires a lot of attention to privacy safeguards, attention paid to whether this data is actually necessary to achieve the goal, or whether the agency is sort of reaching too far. And
what were they actually asking for? Was it location, or was it communications? What is?
So there were a couple of data points, some of which were more sensitive than others. So the one that gave us the greatest concern was that they called for reporting within 24 hours of all communications between passengers in a vehicle that didn't have a driver and a remote operator. So the way that they're enabling literally having no driver in the car is that there'll be a remote operator that the company is operating that can interface with the passenger while they're in the ride. And this proposed decision called for sharing of all communications. It was very non-specific. It called for there to be a public version and a confidential version of such communications. So that led us to believe that some of this information would sort of be released by default. But there wasn't a lot of specificity around what is a communication.
So maybe I've called a self-driving vehicle to take me. I live not in California, obviously, in Potomac, Maryland, but I live like a 10-minute drive away from the metro. And so it's like a pain in the neck. Once I get in my car, I might as well just come to the office. I'd rather easily get to the metro. There's no logical bus for me to take. And I would love to get picked up and let the self-driving vehicle maybe queue around my neighborhood. And then it's a pretty straight road to drop at the metro stop. So if I called or I got in the queue via an app, but then the vehicle, I don't know, decided it didn't want to come up my driveway, or I changed my mind, or I wanted to cancel, or I don't know. There are all kinds of reasons why I might be calling the operator. And that automatically being, dumped, made public or dumped with the commission feels a little, it could be a little bit intrusive to individuals.
Yeah, and we're in the early stage of figuring out how these services will work. You can imagine being in a car and having a health issue arise and needing to communicate about that with an operator. It's not clear, the way it's written, it could include your whole voice transcript. It could include the actual audio of you calling them. It's a very non-specific approach.
So why do they want this? I mean, clearly they have is it they want to monitor and understand how well, are people unhappy? Is it not working? Are people calling saying, hey, the car is overcharging me, or it won't take me, it's taking me to McDonald's. You must have a sponsorship with them. I mean, they want to look into making sure this stuff is operating, safely and in a consumer-friendly way, but it just grabbing the entire transcript feels like overkill, right?
Yeah, this particular element seemed like it was not particularly well thought through. They want to ensure that these services treat consumers well, as do the companies involved, and it seems like they overstepped a bit on this particular point. They didn't offer specifics. They didn't specify safeguards. this seems like an obvious one that should be thought through and changed, and hopefully will be. And we provided some guidance in our comments on how to incorporate safeguards. The other main data elements that they called for were a little bit more operationally focused, and they called them anonymized. And I think to a large...
Those fighting words, they're awesome. Privacy
yes.
anonymized. Under the GDPR, under what?
To examine them closely. I would say as the scale goes, I think that these did give us less concern. It does seem like information that is unlikely to be PII. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it includes information like total monthly vehicle miles traveled, issues that wouldn't actually be linked to a specific individual's location or trip. So we didn't weigh in on those as much. But another area we weighed in on is the way the process works is they come up with a proposed decision, a number of parties weigh in, and then those comments can be considered. So there were a number of other comments where folks actually asked for additional data collection. So a couple of entities affiliated with the city of San Francisco that called for the CPUC to collect more data than initially proposed. And that would include information that we find to be very sensitive, such as GPS location of all pickups and drop-offs, as well as potentially times of day. So we also responded to those concerns in the similar fashion that we did to the New York approaches to collecting this type of data. So we definitely pushed back on those.
So, this is an important issue for us. Kelsey Finch, one of our other policy councils, works on smart city issues, and we appreciate the need for cities to be able to do smart urban planning, to have access to data. Uber's provided a tool, for instance, that lets cities query and get information about traffic flows at a high level. So we're not out there saying privacy, cities can't have the information they need to regulate or to do the sort of administrative policymaking, the evidence-based policymaking that they need. We think we all should be for that with the appropriate privacy controls, but getting that balance right. Lauren and the team here will post our filing for those who want to get deeper into it. We welcome your thoughts and reaction. And thanks for joining us today, Lauren. Thanks for joining me. Lauren Smith, Policy Counsel at FPF. Thanks for being with us, and happy Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Robot.